Hi, I'm Steve Kozak, and welcome back to the online study of preparing for PPA certification. We're still on lighting, moving on to Section C of the test specifications. Section C says, understand light modifiers, including light blockers, black reflectors, gels, spots, flags, etc., and their uses. Now there's 3 items from this section, and it's a fairly long section, but some of it's pretty remedial information. Probably most of us sort of already know. But I think our trick here is going to be, let's see if we can identify where those 3 questions might come from. Number 1 adds knowledge of use of modification devices to achieve desired effects, including gels, reflectors, umbrellas, softboxes, foil, parabolics, etc. So let's get right into our discussion of lighting modifiers. We'll begin with parabolic reflectors. Parabolic reflectors are designed to increase the efficiency of a light by focusing the light forward or into a more narrow beam. You'll recognize parabolics by their traditional bowl shape, which is what works in keeping the light beaming forward. Now, parabolics generally create a very harsh light, and so when photographers use parabolics without any other lighting modifiers, they tend to feather the light. In other words, to move the light left or right in order to use the edge of the light rather than the hard focused beam of light that comes directly from the center. You know, if I was going to ask a question on the CPP test, I might ask about the shape of a parabolic, and I might ask how it would traditionally be used in order to soften that light. So your answer there you would be looking for would be feathering. Not saying that's on the exam, but that's something I would be looking for. I would also make note that it is a rather harsh light. The next lighting modifier on our list is the umbrella. Now, umbrellas create a much more soft and diffused light, so it's ideal for creating a lighting pattern that has less shadows or softer shadows than the hard light that you would get from the parabolic. One of the things that you would like to know about umbrellas is that there's different finishes to the umbrella. Everything from silver or a highly polished silver to a very muted brushed silver, but there's also gold umbrellas, there's white umbrellas, there's umbrellas that you shoot through, so they're more translucent. So again, all of these are an effort to modify the light. A more reflective surface in that umbrella is going to create a harder quality of light. So like your silvers and maybe your brushed silvers, even the golds would create a harder quality of light than, let's say, a white umbrella that creates a much softer quality of light. The next lighting modifier on our list is the softbox. Now, softboxes come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. You can get softboxes for your portable flash all the way to huge softboxes for your studio flash. Generally, softboxes are made, again, to create a very soft quality of light. And the larger the light source, the softer the quality of light. So it's kind of interesting. You can have a really large softbox, let's say a 4x6 softbox, and it still produce a hard light if you have it too far away from your subject, because relatively speaking, when you move that light further away, it's getting smaller and smaller, therefore harder and harder. It's only when you bring that light source in closer to the subject that as it's getting larger and larger, that it's getting softer and softer. Softboxes will have various materials on the inside that kind of bounce the light around before it comes out of the front of the box. There may also be a diffusion panel that's inside the box so that it sort of softens that light before it even gets to the front panel, so that you don't have really hot spots or a hot spot of light right in the center of the softbox. It does a good job of dispersing that light more evenly throughout the front of the box. There's variations of a softbox. One of my favorites is the strip light. I like I believe mine's 9x18, or there's all kinds of shapes, very narrow strip lights. And those are terrific for being able to control a little bit more directly where you want that light to go. I use mine as a hair light, which is wonderful for groups because it spreads that light evenly over the entirety of the group, so long as my group's not too big. But you understand what I'm saying. I can also use it as a main light or as a kicker light or as a fill light or some sort of accent light. It's very versatile. Still a softbox, but because of its shape, it's defined as a strip light. Another lighting modifier we'll talk about is a scrim, and that's nothing more than a translucent panel. The panel on the front of a softbox is considered to be a scrim, but you can buy much larger scrims to take a hard quality of light and let it filter through that scrim or pass through that scrim, therefore making it softer. Scrims can be used in daylight or with artificial light or with flash to create a much softer quality of light. A snoot is a wonderful lighting modifier which directs the light into a much more narrow and defined beam. So it can be used to appear something like a spotlight that can be used on the subject, or you could even put it onto a background to create some unique modeling light to your background. But another great use for it is to use it as a hair light. There are various types of snoots. There's a focusable snoot, which allows you to move the snoot in and out, which creates either a broader beam or a more narrow beam. But if you're able to use a snoot sometime, I think you'll really like the variety of things that you can do with it. Barn doors are a very useful lighting modifier, and they're used basically to control light, to keep the light off of the areas you don't want it. Barn doors can include louvers on the side of the light, both sides of the light, and top and bottom of the light. You may see barn doors that are just a pair of louvers or even 4 louvers that really customize where that light is allowed to go and where it's not allowed to go. Grids are also known as egg crates. Those would fit over a softbox of any size and shape to help create a more direct path of the light and to keep it from spreading out too far left and right and top and bottom. When you use that grid, it's more like a focusing tool to really focus and direct that light forward, and to perhaps even help you keep stray light off of a background or out of the camera, or just again other places that you don't want that light to go. Sometimes a grid would be known as a honeycomb grid. With our snoots and some of our other lighting apparatus, we can get honeycomb grids to go into those snoots or to attach to them, and you'll hear sometimes people talk about a honeycomb grid spot, and that's really nothing more than a snoot with a honeycomb grid on it that really does a fantastic job of focusing that beam into a very narrow area. Louvers also attach to soft boxes, and they work something like blinds in that you can open them up or close them down to direct the light where you want it to go, or to even block out maybe some of the lighting on the bottom. You could close the louvers at the bottom of the softbox and leave just the top louvers open so that you're directing more light to the top of your subject. So louvers are easily identified because they look like traditional window blinds. The next lighting modifier we'll talk about are gels. Gels are basically sheets of acetate that cover a light source to do a variety of jobs. One is that it might polarize the light, or it might even reduce the output of the light by being something of a neutral density filter. But our usual traditional use of gels is to change the color of the light or to color correct the light. So we've got a lot of opportunities to use gels. This might be a good source for a question on the CPP exam. With color gels, you simply color the light, cover the light with the color gel that you wish to use, and you can use that to project the light onto a background to produce a variety of color effects. You'll also learn that putting a gel light on a white background tends to give you some pastel colors, where projecting a gel onto a black background tends to give you richer, deeper colors. And one of my favorite things to do is to project a gel light onto a background that's the same color as the gel that I'm using, because you get really, really intense color when, for example, you put a red gel onto a red paper background. So gels are generally used to add color to that light. Now, in color correction, we might use gels, for example, if we're using our studio lights, which are daylight balanced, and we come indoors and photograph on an interior scene where we're using tungsten lights at 32K or 3000K, roughly thereof, then we can gel our daylight lights or studio lights to have the output of a tungsten light, so that now our studio lights match the environmental lights, and you don't have this crazy mixed color lighting sources that you sometimes have to deal with. Another tremendous use for gels is to use a tungsten gel onto your portable strobe. And so this is a wonderful tool when you're working inside a wedding or a venue where, again, you've got natural tungsten light that tends to be very warm. You introduce your daylight balance flash, and it's very cool, and those colors kind of clash. So you could put a tungsten gel on your portable flash in order to balance the flash to the lighting in the church or in that environment. And then by setting your camera to the tungsten setting or the Kelvin setting for tungsten light, then now everything looks normal from your flash to the light in the room because everything's balanced and everything's color corrected. So our next lighting modifier to talk about would be a gobo or a flag. Now, sometimes photographers refer to the little disc that fits into a spotlight to project a pattern onto a background or onto a scene as a gobo. We tend to call those through our portrait world a cookie or a cucularis, but we'll talk about that in a minute. In this reference, a gobo is anything that you put to go in between the light source and something else. So you could put a gobo in between a main light and, let's say, a background to keep light from striking the background. You could put a gobo or a flag in between a light and maybe the foreground so that you don't want light spilling onto the foreground. So our common term here might be flag, it might be gobo. I don't exactly know how that will be introduced to you on the exam. I know that the exam test specifications call out a cookie by name. So in this case, we probably want to refer to this as a flag, but obviously by the question when you read it, you should be able to make out what they're talking about. Is it something that projects a pattern, or is it something that keeps light off of something else? And if that's what it is, then it's probably a flag or a gobo. Reflectors, we all know and love reflectors. Reflectors are used to add light back into a shadow side of a scene where we've created shadows, or to use to reflect light back into a scene where we need a little bit stronger illumination on something. It might be used as a main light, but generally a reflector is used as a fill light. They're generally going to be white or gold or silver of various finishes, either polished or brushed. In general, a white reflector tends to reflect back a softer quality of light, where a silver reflector would be used to create a bit more of a specular quality of light, where a gold reflector would be used to reflect a warm quality of light onto the subject. Now there's also a black reflector, which can be used something like a gobo or as a flag, but it's used in a subtractive lighting environment, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. But the black reflectors are used to add lighting contrast to a subject by eliminating some of the light that is falling on the subject, and covering light that comes in from overhead, for example, so that only the side light comes in. That's a subtractive lighting technique. But you can use the black reflector to block light, or actually to reflect black back into the shadows. So very versatile. So now we talk about cookies or cucularis, which is a disc that's placed in between the light source and the subject in order to project very specific and distinct patterns onto a background or into the scene. So it can be custom made. You can buy these ready-made in all sorts of sizes and shapes, and they're great for adding interest into a background, and to even use in combination with a gel to create even more exciting backgrounds and more exciting patterns in your images. You know, another interesting lighting modifier that can be used is simply foil. Now, I'm sure you could use traditional aluminum foil, but there is a definite photographic foil, also probably in an aluminum foil. Tends to be black when you buy it from a camera supply place instead of silver when you buy it from Walmart. But with this foil, you can actually just create any kind of custom device that you want. You can use it to block light. You can cut out shapes in the foil and project light through it. You can use it as a kind of a flag in order to keep light from spilling into a foreground. Foil's a very wonderful tool that, again, you can custom shape it any way you want and make it do whatever you want it to do to fit whatever needs you're trying to generate at the time you're creating that image. So let's talk about a couple of lighting terms here. The first one that we're going to talk about is catch lights. Now, catch lights are those points of light that you see in a portrait subject's eyes that are created from the light source that you were using to illuminate that subject. Traditionally speaking, we like the catch lights to be at the 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock position. That indicates that the light is in a traditional position that's not too high, not too low. I usually suggest that you put your main light and your fill light at least a foot above the subject's head, because that way that kind of puts that catch light in that 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock position. Traditionally speaking, we also retouch out the fill light catch light, because in the real world we only have one light source, which is the sun, and so somewhere along the lines the photo god said we should only have one catch light. So that's the way it is. So another lighting term we'll talk about is the key of an image. Now, I'm not talking about the main light being referred to as a key light, because sometimes you will hear photographers talk about the key light and they're just really talking about the light that was doing the main illumination, or in other words, the main light. When we talk about the key of the photograph, we're talking about the overall tonal values of that image. And the two terms that you'll hear the most will be high key and low key. With high key images, you're talking about an image that has generally light or white values. The lighter in colors make up the key of that image, so we call it high key. When you're talking about an image that uses generally the darker colors or the deeper colors, then that image is said to be in low key. And it's kind of one of those things where when you're using a low key composition, you don't want to introduce something that's white into that scene, because it's going to be either a distraction or your eye is going to want to go to that because it's the brightest part of that dark scene. So it would be said that that white object is out of key. Now, the same thing could be said for a high key image, but you know, a lot of high key images are like, for example, brides wearing their white dress and their white veil on a white background. Wonderful, but there's no problem with photographing, let's say, a senior or someone in a black dress on a white background. Would that be technically a high key image? Probably not. It would be a portrait on a high key background, but it wouldn't necessarily be considered a high key image. And we see this a lot in image submission, where someone photographs a subject wearing a dark colored shirt on a white background, and they're trying to use that as a high key image. It's not going to pass, because what we're looking for here is that you're able to control the values of a white piece of clothing or a white element in that scene against a white background, and that you can hold detail in all those various shades of white, and that they don't all block up and blend together. The other place we see issues is on your low key images, where you indeed put someone in a black shirt, maybe they have dark hair, and you photograph them on a dark background or a black background, and the problem occurs when you don't have enough separation there so that the shirt or the hair blends directly into the background, and you can't see where the background begins and the hair ends. So it's really important that you understand in low key, the job here is to demonstrate that you can control the lighting and still get detail in all those various shades of black, and not let them get blocked up and blended into one tonal value where you can't see the layers of tonal values. This is another one of my favorite lighting techniques, and that is to produce a rim light. Rim light is when you create that bright outer glow of light coming from the back side of the subject that illuminates the outline of the subject. So in this example, you'll see that this model was photographed using a rim light that goes all the way around her hair and really outlines her hair and gives it a really nice fashion, kind of a fashion look. Alright, on to section 2, and we've already talked just a little bit about it already. Section 2 says, knowledge of additive and subtractive light. Additive light is simply in the situations where you are introducing a secondary light source to illuminate your subject or the scene. Maybe it's because you're wanting to correct some deficiencies in the main light or the ambient light. Maybe it's because you want to increase the illumination on the shadow side because the shadows have gotten too deep. In any situation where you're adding light to the environment, that would be an additive light scenario. So let's look at a couple of them. In this image, you can see that the main light's created very strong shadows, and in this broad lit pattern, the light is not putting any light on the shadow side of the face. So we need to get into an additive light environment where I can introduce some additional light to handle those shadows, and we'll call that additive light a fill light. Imagine that. So here's the image with the fill light introduced, and its job was simply to add light to the shadows. We've talked about that when we talked main and fill a bit, but this helps us control the contrast by having that fill light. We've already talked about the ratio of the main light to the shadow side, or the main light and the fill light. And so this is an additive light example. Here's another additive light example which we're photographing in low key. In this image, the main light's kind of coming from the back side and giving us a really nice Rembrandt lighting pattern on the face. You can recognize Rembrandt lighting from the little triangle of light underneath the opposite side cheek and under the eye, or that little triangle in the shadow side. But I felt like the shadows were a little too deep and a little too strong, and I needed to bring in just a little bit of illumination, and my solution here was to bring in just a simple reflector and kind of feathering that reflector just a bit so that it didn't create a really strong, harsh reflection of light. I just used the edges of that light so that it made it nice and soft, and put in just enough light to fill those shadows. In this example, I used an additive light technique where the window light was creating too strong of a shadow on the shadow side of this groom. So my additive light source was simply to use a bounce flash, and pointing my flash up at the ceiling and allowing it to bounce back down, create a very nice soft lighting pattern, and just enough in there to illuminate the background a bit and to put a little bit more light on his face and to make that image a lot more pleasant to look at. So subtractive light is kind of the opposite of what we just talked about. This is a situation where we're using an element such as a flag or a gobo or a black reflector to block light in order to have better control over the light source and the lighting direction. Here's a classic example of a subtractive lighting technique. I photographed this bride with open, overcast skies, nothing overhead, and when you get that kind of lighting pattern, what it does is it illuminates from the top down, and you can see that it's lighting up her forehead nicely and her cheeks, but it's created really dark shadows in her eyes and on the lower part of her mouth, and just really not a pleasant lighting pattern at all. And there's a lot of photographers who say, well, I'm a natural light photographer, and when I see something like this, my answer is, yeah, I can tell. So I know that's not you because you're studying for the CPP. But what we want to do here is introduce a subtractive lighting technique, and the best way to do that is to just block the overhead light. So my solution to this was about 10 steps away. When I moved her underneath an eave that was basically a covered walkway in between buildings, I now blocked out the entirety of the overhead light, and now I'm forcing the light to come in from the sides. That's giving me so much more control, and giving me such a nicer lighting pattern of having that light come in from the left to act more like a main light, and to even have some fill light coming in from the opposite side. So it is that canopy that is the subtractive light tool that I used. A black reflector does this also very nicely. But I'm almost always trying to work in situations where I have a canopy overhead when I'm working outdoors, so that I can work on the fringe of that canopy where the light sort of starts coming in underneath it, but no light from above is allowed to strike the subject, because that's where you get those really bad shadows. And basically the solution is a subtractive lighting technique. Here's a subtractive lighting technique in doing a still life shot of a flower. You can see in the setup here that we just used a black piece of foam core to sort of cover the light from overhead, so that now the lighting can only come in from the side. I added a second piece of black foam core to create a new background, because the background back there was so busy and so bright and so contrasty. And so this was the final result of that image, by using a black piece of foam core as the background and using a black piece of foam core in a subtractive lighting technique. Here's another great subtractive lighting technique to change the tonality of a background. You can see in this image that I'm set up using a white background, and the main light's simply allowed to go wherever it wants to. I'm using an umbrella, so there's really no control over where the light is going. But I still like the look of the umbrella. But by bringing in my flag and blocking the light off of the background with the flag, I'm able to completely change how that background looks. So there's kind of two things here. We're using a gobo or a flag to block the light, but it's still a subtractive lighting technique, because I'm changing the environment by not letting light go places I don't want it to go, using subtractive lighting. Here's another example of this using a different background, but how you can get a lot of variety of looks by having a light just illuminate the background, or by bringing in your flag using a subtractive lighting technique and subtracting the light off the background, or blocking the light off the background, and now you've got a completely different look. Well, that does it for section C. I hope that was helpful. And now it's on to section D.